So I totally agree with Ian on this idea that now essentially the crypto exchanges, the large mining companies and other organizations like that, they've essentially become the new financial institutions that crypto was supposed to make obsolete. But I think that there is a slight difference, which is that, and I've used the word cryptocracy to describe this, because Nakamoto's original idea was we don't need democracy. We can just forgo that and replace that with technology. But instead of actually managing to replace democracy or some form of human rule, he inadvertently brought about this cryptocracy, which in Greek, I suppose, would mean hidden rule or rule by the unknown, because the who has power in this new financial system is, if possible, even more opaque than in the sort of incumbent established financial system, and mechanisms of accountability even less clear. At least the Securities Exchange regulation is something that, in theory, citizens could influence through their voting decisions. But in the sort of crypto economy, there are undoubtedly policymakers who are doing things like monetary policy. If you think about the issuance of various stable coins, that have no connection whatsoever to any accountability mechanisms that the users of the system could access. So that this is what I'm calling cryptocracy in Cloud Empires, the book.
Speaking of cryptocracy, sorry, go on. Address Vili's point, but also maybe bring in the Ethereum example, because I think what's going on with the transition from proof of work to proof of stake and the political dimension to that, and how it will make Ethereum more or less resilient, I think it feeds into that, and who has the power in that arrangement.
Going back to what the origins of Bitcoin were, I would say that what happened in the 1990s and 2000s was strongly influential. In the late 90s, we had eGold. In the early 90s, we had David Chaum's DigiCash. During the 2000s, we had things like Liberty Reserve, Liberty Dollar, and a bunch of other various things. Now, all of these failed in some respect or other. And if you look deeply into why they failed, it was always not that the technology wasn't suitable, but the people brought it down by one means or another. And another example that is actually apropos to Bitcoin is payment systems for gambling. In many countries, gambling is quite legal. In other countries, especially the US, online gambling was illegal. And that was mostly based on the vested interests of the Las Vegas casinos, who didn't want the competition, so they made sure it was banned. Now, how did they ban it? Well, they went after the payment systems. So the payment systems chopped themselves off anybody who was doing online gaming. And this was very obvious to anybody who was in the field. Out of these experiences came the notion that the people are the problem. The technology is fine. So how do we build a technology where the people can't unfairly shut people out of the system? And that's where, if you like, the early thinking that created Bitcoin derived from. So it's very much it's not a political argument at all.
There. No, you inserted the word unfairly there, because you removed that word and the statement is still true, isn't it?
Yes. Oh, absolutely. And unfairly brings in the political dimension. Who gets to say what is unfair and what is not?
Right. Well, this goes back to our original discussion as to whether the collective, whether a society ought to have the ability to collectively decide that certain things are not okay and certain things are okay, or whether in fact we should just the whole idea of permissionlessness. And this gets us into the how these ideologies shaped Bitcoins and cryptocurrencies design. And part of that is the permissionlessness, right? So that the idea that anyone should be allowed to do anything without asking anyone for permission. And the related idea of censorship resistance, which means that no authority ought to have the power to prevent transactions, whether for good or for bad, right? So let's eliminate a government or any other regulatory authority from the picture altogether, so as to prevent them doing bad things, but also prevent them from doing things which at least some people would consider legitimate interventions. And all of these things were baked into the technology. And partly for that reason, it was originally conceived as a peer-to-peer architecture, not a, for instance, you could imagine a federated version, something like EduRoam is a federated Wi-Fi system maintained by the world's universities. It's a global federated system. You could imagine an EduCoin, which is a federated system where the nodes are universities and you can pay in their co-ops and whatnot. But that would imply trusting the universities, the users trust the universities. And for that reason, Bitcoin is conceived not as a centralized, as you pointed out, the centralized services, you're inherently trusting somebody. It's conceived not as a centralized service, not as a federated service, but as a peer-to-peer system. And
it's also worth adding.
Was to, yeah, sorry.
It's also worth adding that we as a society accept this because we have cash. We have permissionless cash. We can do transactions with ourselves. We don't have to ask anybody any permission. And that has economically been a very stable and forceful thing in the economy. It's the thing that made the economy work. Now we've moved to digital systems. We're having a rethink about whether that's still okay. And you've now got the competitive notion that the banks would like to get rid of cash because it's a lost transaction to them. Now, ideologies get layered on both sides to support the position. But it is the case that peer-to-peer permissionless systems are what we accept as society. And it's going forward that people are trying to change our minds on that position.
But it's not exactly accurate that cash was entirely uncontrolled, right? So large denominations are not available in many jurisdictions. Large amounts of cash attract scrutiny. There's unexplained wealth orders and so on. Moving large amounts of cash across borders does require declarations and does require explanation. So it is incorrect to say that previously we just used to have this bare instrument and no regulation on it whatsoever at all. And now we're
these are all
new
innovations. These are all new innovations in the last 30 to 40 years.
Sure.
And if you go back before then, large amounts of cash were never a problem. Hence, the drug dealers would turn up with big duffel bags of cash into the bank, and the bank would say, yes, of course, you can deposit that cash here.
Yeah, well, I would say that's a problem, right?
Well, now the narrative,
we're a problem.
Yeah, now the narrative is that's a problem. But so then the narrative was,
here
it's
we
none
get
of your
into
business.
These value differences, right? Whether we consider drug dealers showing up at the bank with large amounts of cash, whether you consider that a problem that government ought to intervene or not. But that is a fair.
What I find fascinating about
what
I find fascinating about this is the subjectivity of what is a bad guy, because I think within the FATF rules themselves, there is now an acknowledgement of the ambiguity in terms of like what is a bad guy, like what is fair use and what isn't fair use. And it comes about especially in the political terrorists, one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. So a bank robber stealing lots of like cash to empower himself or go off and live in the Caribbean, that's one thing. But if it's like a Ukrainian freedom fighter stealing money because he wants to help power up his troops and buy equipment to defend Russia, that suddenly becomes much more justifiable, right? Now,
Ukrainians don't need to steal money from anybody to fund their fight. They're getting donations. Please, let's not use Ukrainians as a vehicle for arguing for.
It is important because it's a subjective perception over like whether that transaction is legitimate, and where so we ban the sourcing of financial transactions for any sort of form of like arms or drugs, etc., are considered illegal. But if you are funding arms for Ukraine, suddenly that becomes subjectively different. So I think it's actually a very important point, and Ukraine is just one example. It could be any other kind of political fight that we're deciding to support.
Sure.
It's just an example, and I think that ambiguity is entirely a political perspective on what is
Absolutely.
a just cause and what
Yeah,
isn't.
absolutely. Yeah, and I certainly don't agree with the U.S. government on many things. I suppose, but just to go back to how the design of Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies reflects some of the original values and ideology. One area that we haven't touched on at all is this sort of central bank conspiracy theorist thinking that was quite common in the 90s in the cypherpunks mailing list and so on. And this sort of hard money and Austrian economics and sort of this whole aspect of it, which is reflected in particular in the idea that you have a 21 million Bitcoin cap on the money pool, which of course in practice doesn't really work, because it's entirely possible to build fractional reserve banking on top of cryptocurrencies, and it has been done, which then acts as a multiplier in the money pool the same way, and the money supply in the same way as it does in the conventional financial system. But there was this idea that if we have a policy of a limited number of a limited supply of money, this is a good policy, as opposed to, for instance, a price stability policy, which is what central banks in North America and Europe are pursuing. And so this is again not to argue necessarily for the European Central Bank's position as the only correct one on this one, but I think this is a very concrete way in which certain ideological views are baked into the technology.
But speaking of the baking in of certain political views, I would love Ian's view on the kind of the transition in Ethereum and the political dimension of that, how it impacts how the design is going to impact the reality of using Ethereum and serving the objectives of the original community.
Yeah, I think it's important to remember that the big Ethereum move was not about switching from proof of work to proof of stake originally. It was about the fact that the system that they had built wasn't well scaled. It couldn't handle the transaction load. So to solve that, they had to move to a new design. And they spent a long time trying to work out what that new design was. And that just reflects the difficulty of the problem they were facing. Along the way, the political issue of using proof of work as opposed to proof of stake became important. And it was, if you think about the people on the Ethereum side, most of them, if you like, are less libertarian, more on the left side, more, shall we say, socially minded, and more interested in doing good for the planet, etc., etc. So for them, the notion of proof of work burning up the planet was anathema, and it got added in as a goal. And that's the way I perceive it. I don't think it was necessarily, shall we say, the solution to the great driving problem of Ethereum. That to me was always the scaling argument. And the same thing happened with BTC. It's got a scaling difficulty out of which popped the notion of Lightning and higher layer networks to be able to start doing transactions at mass scale, because you need that if you're going to actually change the world. Then the issue you have with proof of work and proof of stake and so forth, proof of work does in fact guarantee permissionless entry to the system by all, including the miners. Proof of stake less so, in the sense that once you get proof of stake up and going, you find that the people who have put large amounts of stake in the system start to dominate the system. And they do it in a lazy fashion. They put their value in and it's stuck there. They can't get it out because there has to be a, if you like, a penalty for them to leave the system. So it just sticks there. But then they start to dominate and they become attachable players. Whereas with proof of work, you've got to fight. You've got to buy mining equipment. You've got to power it up. You've got to keep it running. And eventually your stuff has to be replaced. So there's a dynamic inside the mining system that causes replacement. Miners rise up, they discover they're caught, they go bankrupt, and they move on. But other miners then in different countries with different electricity schedules and different mining schedules and so forth, they manage to take their place. So there's a much more, if you like, dynamic, what was the term, chaos, what was his name? Christensen. The notion of the industry rising up and then seeing itself destroyed and be replaced by new industries over and over. You get that with proof of work. Creative destruction. Yeah. Yes, and you get that cycle with creative destruction, but you don't get it so much with proof of stake because it's lazy. And consequently, it is going to become much more institutionalized, much more quickly than, say, proof of work.
Right. I think that's a wonderful distinction that you've drawn there between the sort of the Bitcoin and the Ethereum communities. I think I've focused very much on Bitcoin so far, but obviously even in the early days of which I'm talking about 70s and 80s and 90s, which I only know of through reading about stuff, but there was always besides the sort of right-wing anarchist ideology, which is extreme libertarianism, anarcho-capitalism, you always had some people who aligned more with sort of left-wing anarchism, sort of anarcho-syndicalism. For instance, Julian Assange was active in the cypherpunks mailing list in the 90s, and he was very much alive to the danger of sort of unaccountable corporate power besides unaccountable government power. And he was in favor of labor unions, for instance, which for others such as Tim May, who was a sort of leader in the community, were quite an anathema. And even as sort of Tim May then veered towards all the sort of extreme right-wing tropes, anti-Semitism and racism, misogynism, and so on, this sort of leftist streak took a different path. And this is quite a broad generalization, and I would assume that lots of Bitcoiners and lots of Ethereum people would vehemently disagree with being placed in these categories. But I think it is possible to see this kind of a difference of shade between these two communities, and it's even reflected in the designs of the system. So in Bitcoin, there is no notion of common property. Everything is private property. There are no commons, right? But in Ethereum, you can have DAOs, you can have distributed autonomous organizations, which sort of own things in common. Now, the problem they run into is that from the perspective of sort of leftist anarchism, is that they're still owned. So rather than being cooperatives, they are more like joint stock companies where a capitalist can come and buy all the governance tokens they need to control the whole system. So I wouldn't say that it's a sort of anarcho-syndicalist stream, but there is a little bit more sort of recognition of these issues of a community acting together. And that's also, as you say, it's reflected in the attitudes towards the massive environmental burden that the proof of work algorithm is imposing on us. And in the Bitcoin community, you see, I think, a sort of indifference sometimes towards the climate as a public good, because there is an idea that it's not private good, it's not, it doesn't exist, or a sort of Panglossian belief that somehow, in fact, this massive energy expenditure will help to incentivize market solutions to this problem, which I don't. For the record, I think it's quite lazy thinking. If you analyze those claims in detail, I don't think they hold up. Talk to an energy engineer. Whereas as Ian, you say, I think in the Ethereum community, there's a heartfelt concern over the Vitalik Buterin himself has very clearly said that, if his only impact in the end will have been to just hasten the climate crisis, he will be very unhappy with that. So there's a heartfelt desire to replace proof of work with an alternative system. which then comes with other trade-offs.
It's certainly the case that with the governance of things like the DAOs, yes, they created something that looks vaguely like a company with stockholders and so forth, or however you want to model it, if you want to model it as a corporation. But it's just a facade. And basically, we've got a group of people who don't understand governance, discovering governance, and being too lazy to go and read the thousands of years of governance experience that is out there. So slowly, they're learning year by year what we've known for thousands of years. Okay, knock yourself out, have some fun. As long as you're not hurting anybody, that's fine, which is, of course, a problem.
That is, you've put it so wonderfully. I fully agree with that. It's sort of rediscovering everything that humanity knows about governance and government, but through trial and error. It's in the same way as the crypto world has been a process of rediscovering why we have financial regulations in place, one crisis at a time. So we're sort of retracing those steps, and I actually think that's a broader thing in tech, because I'm, you know, in my book, in the Cloud Empires, I'm in fact claiming that also these large centralized digital platform companies, they have through trial and error, they've evolved into something that resembles a state, right? You know, Mark Zuckerberg said it himself. He said, you know, actually, we're more, we've realized that we're more like a government than a traditional company. So after 20 years or 15 years of moving fast and breaking things, right? Like trying to literally break things and break the existing institutions, all they've managed to do is to rediscover the same sort of functions that government has been doing for the past several millennia, essentially. And so I think that's just a very, very fascinating finding. Everything, there's nothing new under the sun. We just rediscover old ancient wisdom.
Is my standard sort of default on everything. But as a historian, ancient historian, I definitely consider that to be the case. Meet the old boss, same as the old boss. We all become our parents eventually. We all have to go through these learning curves. But I think I've come to the conclusion that it's still worthwhile doing that whole kind of exercise of relearning things, because every now and then something new emerges that we didn't see. That doesn't mean a lot of that relearning is pointless, but we have every so often a new generation that has to learn these things. The question is, do they learn it in universities or do they learn it through trial and error? In some ways, these like crypto systems are a very interesting kind of educational proxy, a sort of synthetic educational environment, almost like a test net or whatever. You're learning through experience rather than, or an MBA, rather than doing things academically. But I want to just go back to your point about central banks and the Austrian kind of perspective that has been influencing everything. Because I can't help but wonder if fundamentally it all comes down to like varying cultural perspectives on risk appetite, and how, to what, not even every culture is different, and it has a different perspective on how much protection they demand from the state versus, freedom of the individual. And the US famously, is the home of the brave, and there is an expectation that, there is a smaller government and it was built by pioneers and all that sort of malarkey. Is there an argument that maybe the problem at the heart of all of these conversations is the totalitarian mindset that wants to kind of ensure that one system triumphs over everything? And maybe the real solution is that what we need to preserve are lots of different competing systems with different risk appetites, so that if you're not comfortable in one environment, you still have the freedom to choose to leave and go to a different environment. And if that is the case, that I guess the concern about these massive corporate monopolies or government systems is that eventually everything will become the same, and there won't be the freedom of choice for the individual to live according to his own risk appetite. Am I talking rubbish? What do you think of that hypothesis?
It's a nice idea that there could be a market for rules. this is a sort of in libertarian economics. This is an established idea that there's a market for rules, there's competing rule systems, and then individuals choose under which rule system they want to play the game. And that way everyone gets what they want. There's no need for sort of governance institutions like voting and elections and stuff, because market choice decides which, well, allocates people to different rule sets. The problem in practice is that if you want to keep transacting with the people that you're transacting, you cannot unilaterally choose to switch to a different set of rules. So there are network effects, in other words. We have, as a society or as a community, we have to choose collectively which rule set we wish to follow. This is known as a collective problem, collective choice problem. And markets are notoriously bad at solving collective choice problems. It's possible for there to be a network that everyone hates. Everyone who uses it hates it. But because they each individually face a huge switching cost if they try to leave it, that bad network wins and a better network loses. Only by coordinating their choices, only by deciding, okay, we're all going to jump now together, can those people actually adopt a better rule system for themselves. And this is analogous then to political institutions like voting, which, though imperfect, they allow us to make collective choices.
But I think that this is where the political economy comes into it for sure. But you know, conventionally, historically, we've had two different sort of legal environments. We've had the laws of the land, which are dictated to by, you know, the specific collectives and the cohesive values those collectives have regarding risk appetite, all sorts of other norms, right? Which may differ from different collectives on the land, right? Those are internal rules based on like how you operate. But then you had the sort of mercantile law of the land, of the sea, which dictated trade in between those different varying sources of, you know, collective values. And the law of the sea was always very different. I mean, this is where the, you know, offshore banking system hails from, the Eurodollar markets. And really the problem always comes about in finance, in my opinion, when the offshore side starts to infiltrate the onshore, or vice versa, when the onshore tries to take over the, you know, the offshore. Perhaps, you know, I see crypto as a sort of like the medium of exchange for that mercantile layer in that sort of neutral zone where you may be forced to trade with an enemy because of you know, necessity, right? It doesn't mean you respect their values, but you need a common sort of understanding of value between each other, which is entirely, you know, neutral and detached from the political ideology that actually maintains value within your own systems. That's where I think there is an opportunity for crypto in that sort of in-between layer. But the cost of that is always going to be high, because by definition, if you're outside of a trust zone, you have to default in game theoretical perspectives to the worst possible outcome, right? So yeah, I mean, that's a bit of theory and, you know, speculation on my part, but you know, by all means, Ian or Vili, tell me if where I'm going wrong with that, if I am.
Well, I think the problem with that approach is that to do that, you need the parties to respect at least the ability to pay and to trade. And currently, it's out of favor in the world scene to respect countries' ability to pay and trade. And of course, the obvious example here is Russia, in that now the West has decided that country is not to be respected and trade and pay, and therefore it's been sanctioned. And they've gone very heavily into this direction. Where it's getting into trouble, of course, is that Russia is a major player in the world scene, and especially in Europe, energy and so forth. So if you want to do that, you can certainly do that. And I'll mention something about crypto soon, but you have to have the respect of the players. And that's kind of short, it's lacking at the moment. Coming on to crypto, one of the things that we can do is we can create our own rule set. We haven't done this much in crypto, but we have done it a little bit. And we actually have the right to do this. What we can do is attach to our code a contractual approach which seeks to set the rules and makes it the rule of the crypto that we're talking about. And we can do this by means of a constitution, which writes out our rules, just like John Barlow did, or we did in the EOS community. And what we can also do is fix those rules into a legal framework by adding arbitration. And this is a legal right encompassed in the laws of just about every country that's out there. Not all of them, but even the ones that don't have it will respect it. And what that gives us is a capability to create our entire set of rules distinct from the national rules. And if we do it properly, it becomes a bulwark. It becomes a protection against the overbearing activities of nations. It's not perfect.
That's a really interesting idea.
Yeah, it's not perfect, but it does work. It does work.
I certainly agree.
Yeah,
I certainly agree, and I think that, and similarly, Izabella, to what you were describing, I'm not sure if in economic history the distinction between mercantile law and domestic rules is quite. I think in recent research shown to be a bit more complex, because predictably the mercantile law is somewhat subject to the prince's interest as well, and its enforcement in particular was contingent to often on actually the temporal powers to enforce it. But I think
when wars would break out, like usually, like that would usually be the trigger for a war, right? So that's when you clash on those collective values about what we agree to, like, you know, in the I think of pirates, right? Pirates, you can't trust pirates, but they all have like parlay, you know.
Well, to some extent, you know, these are slightly modern, sort of romanticized ideas of how it works. But certain economic historians back in the day, they used to draw on these examples and then construct this bit of a fantasy world. But you know, I think it's entirely accurate today to say that many digital platforms have created, in fact, these rule sets, these jurisdictions, quote unquote, which operate somehow above or between national jurisdictions, and people can join them from different countries, and they can trade under the same rule set, under the same institutions, and they have dispute resolution systems. I'm kind of calculating in cloud empires that, in fact, large digital platform companies today solve more commercial disputes every year than all the world's public courts put together. So certainly this is already a reality. And, you know, what Ian was describing, doing something like this with crypto, that's certainly also possible. I don't think the question is whether you can do it or not. The question is that how do you ensure that those rules and the rule makers are accountable to the people who are subject to them. And as I mentioned earlier, the idea that competition will solve it, then people can just switch to another system if they don't like it, that clearly isn't working when we're talking about something like Amazon Marketplace.
No, but perhaps, you know, the you know, back in the day, if you didn't like your political environment, or you weren't happy with the arbitration that, you know, determined your personal situation, you had the option to migrate somewhere else, right? And there were frictions to that. I mean, obviously the great migration of all was the migration to America. I mean, that was the biggest friction of all, like getting on a massive boat and nearly dying, but it was seen as worth it because the costs were so bad in the domestic system, right? So I perhaps the way to look at it is that the friction to migrate is not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, there should be a friction. If there's no friction, then the system becomes kind of blurry, and there
exit scams become easy if there's no friction. Exit scams become easy to pull off if there's no friction to leaving the system.
Yeah.
Right. So maybe the friction, I sometimes think that the internet economy is a little bit too obsessed with removing all frictions. I sometimes think friction is the feature, not the bug. But Ian, any thoughts? I mean, we will probably wrap it up very soon, but what are you thinking?
I suppose the point I would like to make is that we talk about the ideologies and the clash of political ideas and so forth. But in my experience, they have been more narrative than ideology. the various ideologies have been picked up for convenience for the situation. And as soon as that becomes non-convenient, you notice that the crowd finds a new ideology. They migrate their ideology with the convenience of the circumstances. So for example, one example is financial inclusion. The Bitcoin community used to trump up the fact that this gave the right for poor people to come in and use the coin. But then the coin priced itself out of that market and that particular narrative disappeared. And this happens over and over again. Yes, we're fighting the state. Oh, but we want to use fiat, so we have to go through exchanges, so we stop fighting the state anymore. What was the ideology? I think, if anything, the real ideology is how do we make money?
Yeah, that idea of convenience intruding on the dogma is fascinating, and obviously that is what differentiates the kind of like consumerism and greed-driven like cult dynamic in Bitcoin or crypto from a conventional religion, which will like theoretically stick to the dogma no matter what the kind of disadvantage of doing so is, right? So there is a conceptual embrace of having to go through pain and you know, defending your system from your idea from people who are trying to twist your ideology, whereas in this idea that it's malleable in crypto is fascinating and so contrary to the idea of immutable systems, right? So there is a deep set irony there.
Yes.
I think that's a great point, Ian. You know, how it started with let's build a cash system of cash, an actual payment system, but then it didn't take off. It wasn't used for payment purposes. Well, now it's an uncorrelated store of value, or it's a financial inclusion, or you know, it's the narrative keeps changing all the time. And I think for that reason, really, one lesson for policymakers is if you're being told, oh, you must do this thing to enable this this wonderful thing, that's just the latest flavor of the month. And I would really focus, rather than on enabling this whatever is the latest narrative, I would focus on preventing the harms if I was a national policymaker tasked with protecting the interest of my country.
I mean, given this is a policy focused session, I think that's a very interesting point. And I would, to what degree though should policymakers also consider the fact that it's not just about protecting harms, but also going, what does this technology actually bring to the table that we aren't already doing and we haven't already sorted?
Exactly.
You know.
Well, that's the thing, because it doesn't seem to be doing much. There is a narrative, there is a proposal, this is what it'll do. But then when that vision actually fails or is shown to be logically inconsistent or contradictory, then a new vision is substituted for it, as Ian suggested. And for that reason, I don't think the policymakers should latch on too heavily into whatever the latest vision is that is being peddled by the lobbyist. I think they should rather look at, okay, how can I allow these people to play around, you know, try out things without causing harm to other people?
Well, thank you so much. Sorry, go on. Go on, Ian. I'm just going to warn you that my daughter's just run through the door, so I'm just going to block the door.
That's fine. If it's a matter of public policy and we're trying to figure out how to, if you like, improve the situation, let's leave aside regulation. I think the big problem that occurs is that although we have a decent accounting system that allows us to move money back and forth or value back and forth, what we don't have is a decent information system. We don't know what the value is. And specifically, you take Bitcoin, for example, we don't know what it is. We just have a consensus that we think it's valuable and we'll trade it amongst ourselves. Now, if you start adding meaning to that, if you add another coin, you've got to actually differentiate that coin from Bitcoin. You've got to differentiate Ethereum from Bitcoin somehow. And how do we do that? And we can see the logical pathway that this takes, for example, to ICOs and NFTs. ICOs were issued. They had a vague set of promises. They had lots of hand waving and crowd pleasing tricks and so forth. But at the end of the day, what did the issuance mean? And that was never clear. So you had basically a very strong environment for people who would come up and do all the neat tricks at the front and then walk away with the money, because they never actually said they weren't going to walk away with the money. So from a public policy perspective, we need to look at that particular point. When you issue something, you should say what it is. And we know how to do that. We can cryptographically relate your words to that issuance. It's an old technique. I won't mention the names, but why isn't the public policy audience looking at the fundamental problem that ICOs are too vague? They can also go back to their own existing regulatory systems and say, okay, what happens there? Well, to do an issuance, you must file a document with the regulator. Now, it so happens that the regulator just happens to be the place of record because you have to do it somehow. In blockchain, we don't need a regulator. We can simply file the document on the blockchain. We have stores, we have places we can do these things, and we can guarantee uniqueness and the quality of provenance. We can do this cryptographically, but we don't do it. Why don't we do it? Why do we make ICOs completely vague? Why do we make NFTs completely vague? In part, I think it's because we've seduced ourselves into the easy money story. Now, making money is hard. We should make it hard. You should get out there and state what it is you're issuing as a matter of policy. If it's not public policy, it should be a matter of blockchain policy. What is it that you're issuing? And please, let's see the words and tie those words to this particular issue, because later on, we want to control the issuer to stick to his words. And that's something I think the public policy people could do quite happily. They can simply set a rule. You create a document, you lock it to your issue, you show us everybody where it is, and we'll hold you to those words.
I think that's a really interesting point to end it on. I mean, the idea that returns are more intimately linked to the gains, the wealth that is generated through any particular system or ICO or company or whatever innovation, I think is very key, and it also speaks. I think Vili might have not to keep going endlessly, but I think it speaks to the kind of other problem in the tech world about sort of people creating vaporware and exiting, and there not being very much left on the table after they're gone. But on that note, I just want to. I have to go because I've got the intervention of the family. But thank you very much both for taking part. It's been a fascinating conversation, and I've really learned a lot as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.